The candles had been lit an hour before she arrived, and in that hour the wax had begun to pool in the silver holders, softening the light until the bedchamber felt less like a room and more like a painting left too long in the sun. The fire had been built high. Someone, Mrs. Rowe, she supposed, had placed white hothouse roses on the writing desk and turned down the sheets with the kind of careful symmetry that suggested this was a room accustomed to ceremony. Maren stood just inside the door in her wedding nightgown, her dark hair loose against the cambric, and watched her husband pour himself a glass of port from the decanter on the mantel without looking at her. Crispin Voss, the 6th Duke of Fenwick, had the sort of face that looked expensive even in firelight. Straight jaw, dark brows set low over gray eyes that moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to measuring rooms and finding them adequate. He had been handsome at the altar that morning. She had noticed, the way one notices the quality of a frame around a painting one has not yet been permitted to see. He was handsome now, standing in his shirt sleeves with his cravat loosened, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and his back turned to the woman he had married 9 hours ago. He drank, set the glass down, turned. "I should be plain with you," he said. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who had rehearsed. "I married you to save my name, not to know you. I trust you understand the terms." The fire cracked. A log shifted and sent a constellation of sparks up the flue. Somewhere below them, in the servants' hall, someone was still clearing the wedding supper. She could hear the faint percussion of china being stacked, the soft metronome of a household putting itself to bed. Maren looked at him. She had decided what she would do in the carriage on the way to the church, somewhere between the second turning and the third, when the February light had fallen across her gloves, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would not spend 1 hour of grief on a man who had already told her what he was. She had entered the church with that thought folded neatly inside her chest, like a letter she would never need to send. She did not respond. She did not nod, or lower her eyes, or press her lips together in the manner of a woman composing herself. She simply looked at him for a moment longer, long enough for the silence to develop a texture, and then she moved to the chair beside the dressing table, collected her robe and put it on over the nightgown with the quiet precision of someone who had always dressed herself and saw no reason to stop. "Where are you going?" he asked, not alarmed, merely the tone of a man whose schedule had been interrupted. "To my rooms," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." She left the bedchamber before dawn. She left it, in fact, before midnight, and the corridor outside was cold and silent and smelled of beeswax and stone. Her rooms were in the east wing. Mrs. Rowe had shown her that afternoon, apologizing for the distance from the Duke's apartments, as though distance were a deficiency rather than a gift. The bed there had not been turned down with the same ceremony. The roses were smaller and less white. Maren climbed beneath the covers and slept more soundly than she had in weeks. When Crispin Voss came down to breakfast the following morning at 8:30, his wife was already seated. She was eating toast with blackcurrant preserves and reading a letter, from her mother, he would later learn, though he did not ask. And she looked up when he entered with the same courteous, vacant expression one offers a neighbor at a coaching inn, pleasant, entirely without interest, entirely without. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "The coffee is still hot." He sat. He watched her eat. She did not appear distressed. She did not appear to be performing the absence of distress, which would have been worse and also easier to navigate. She appeared to be a woman eating toast who had simply continued with her morning. He had expected tears, or silence of the punishing variety, the kind his mother deployed, weighted and theatrical, designed to draw inquiry. This was neither. This was a woman who had taken him at his word and arranged herself accordingly. "I trust you slept well," he said, because the silence was beginning to press against the places where conversation should have been. "Very well, thank you." She turned a page of her letter. "Mrs. Rowe mentioned that the household accounts are kept in the morning room. I thought I might review them after breakfast, if that is convenient." It was convenient. Everything she proposed over the following weeks was convenient. She reviewed the household accounts and found 3 errors the previous housekeeper had let compound for a year and a half. She interviewed the cook about the menus and made adjustments that reduced waste without reducing quality. Tench, his steward, reported this with the faintly bewildered admiration of a man who had not expected competence and was unsure how to categorize it. She received callers in the drawing room with a graciousness that was, by all accounts, faultless. She wore her wedding ring. She used his name, the title, never the Christian name, with the same careful formality she used for the footman. She was, in every observable particular, the Duchess of Fenwick, and she was entirely unreachable. Crispin noticed this the way one notices a draft, not all at once but in accumulated discomfort. At dinner she sat at the opposite end of the table, which was correct, and answered his questions about her day with a fluency that left no opening for further inquiry. In the drawing room after supper, she embroidered or read and responded to his remarks with exactly the right number of words, neither too few to seem rude nor enough to constitute conversation. When he entered a room, she did not leave it. When he spoke, she did not ignore him. She simply occupied the same space with the impenetrable courtesy of a woman who had been told the boundaries and respected them absolutely. It was, he began to realize, maddening. His mother, Lady Voss, the Dowager Duchess, arrived at Fenwick Park 3 weeks after the wedding, ostensibly to see how the household was settling, but in truth, Crispin knew, to inspect the woman she had argued against. She had wanted Lady Honoria Claremont, whose fortune was larger and whose family sat closer to the center of society's approval. Maren Calloway, the daughter of a respectable but unremarkable family whose land bordered the Fenwick estate, had been Crispin's concession to his late father's will, which had specified that the financial provisions attached to the dukedom would only be released upon marriage to a woman of the late duke's choosing. His father had chosen Maren's family. His father had not explained why. The dowager watched Maren across the breakfast table on her first morning and said, in the particular carrying whisper she had perfected over 40 years of aristocratic displeasure, "She is rather contained, is she not?" "She manages the household very well," Crispin said. "That is not what I asked." He did not answer. He was not, he told himself, troubled by his wife's composure. He had asked for exactly this arrangement. He had been explicit. He had married to satisfy the terms of the will and restore the income the estate required. The tenants' cottages needed roofing. The home farm's drainage had not been repaired since his father's illness began, and the debts his father had accumulated in his final years had pressed the dukedom into a posture that was, if not desperate, then deeply uncomfortable. Maren Calloway came with the unlocking of those funds. He had been honest with her. She had understood. What he had not anticipated was that a woman who understood would be so difficult to sit across from at dinner. Lord Ashby visited in April, when the park was coming into its first green, and the air through the open drawing-room windows carried the sweetness of turned earth and early blossom. He was Crispin's oldest friend. They had been at Eton together, then Oxford, then the inevitable progression of country houses and London seasons that constituted the life of men born to their particular latitude of privilege. Ashby was unmarried, observant, and possessed of the uncomfortable habit of saying nothing until silence itself became a remark. He watched Maren pour tea in the drawing-room. She offered him sugar with a smile that was warm without being intimate, asked after his sister's health with genuine interest, inquired about the roads from Wiltshire, with the practiced ease of a woman who understood that men who had traveled appreciated having the fact acknowledged. She laughed at something Ashby said about the coaching inn at Marlborough, a small, precise laugh that suggested she was genuinely amused and not merely performing amusement, and then she excused herself after precisely the right interval to leave the two men alone. Ashby watched her go. He watched the door close. He watched the quality of the silence she left behind, not an absence but a withdrawal, as though the room's warmth had followed her out. Then he looked at Crispin. "What?" Crispin said. "Nothing. You're looking at me." "I'm looking at the door your wife just closed." He picked up his teacup. "She closed it the way one closes a ledger, very neatly, very finished. She is an excellent hostess. That is not what concerns me." Ashby sipped his tea and set the cup down, with a delicacy that was, itself, a kind of commentary. "What concerns me is that she treated you with precisely the same courtesy she treated me. And I have known you for 20 years, and she married you 6 weeks ago, and there was not 1 degree of difference." Crispin said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a gardener was raking the gravel drive, and the sound came through the windows like the slow turning of pages. The county ball was held at Lord Petersham's estate in the first week of May, and it was here that the architecture of Maren's composure became visible to the wider world, and therefore to Crispin, in a way that their private rooms had not permitted. She wore a gown of pale gold silk, high-waisted as the fashion demanded, with short puffed sleeves and a ribbon of darker gold beneath the bust. Her hair was dressed simply, threaded with small seed pearls that Mrs. Rose Girl had set that afternoon. She looked, Crispin thought as he handed her into the carriage, like something lit from within. The thought arrived uninvited, and he dismissed it with the efficiency he brought to all inconvenient observations. The ballroom at Petersham Hall was large and well lit, the chandeliers lowered and fitted with fresh candles that cast a warm, even glow across the polished floor. The musicians had been brought from Bath. The supper tables were laid in the adjacent room with cold meats and syllabubs and hothouse fruits arranged on tiered stands. Society in the county was not London society, but it was watchful in its own way, and Crispin was aware, as they entered, of the particular quality of attention that attends a new marriage, the glances exchanged between wives, the careful assessments of posture and proximity, the silent calibration of whether this was a union of affection or arrangement. At the ball, she was extraordinary. She danced with Lord Petersham, and then with his eldest son, and then with the vicar, who was 60 and delighted, and told her she had the lightest step he had encountered since his own wife's youth, which made the vicar's wife press her hand to her chest and say she had never liked the new Duchess more. Maren spoke to the wives of 3 neighboring landowners about the drainage works Crispin had begun on the home farm, and made them sound interesting, which was a feat he himself had never managed. She asked Mrs. Holt about her daughter's recovery from the fever, with a specificity that suggested she had been paying attention to the neighborhood's concerns in a way Crispin had not noticed her doing, though she must have been doing it, because the details were too precise to have been invented. She laughed. He heard her laugh across the room, a sound he realized he had not heard before, or had not heard directed at anything other than polite conversation, at something Lady Petersham said about the asparagus beds, and the laugh was natural and unguarded, and carried across the ballroom with the clarity of a bell struck once, and it was directed at everyone in the room except him. She danced with him once, because convention required it. Her hand in his was light and correct. She smiled at him with the same pleasant, courteous expression she had offered him over breakfast on the first morning, and when the dance ended, she curtsied and thanked him, and moved away with the seamless grace of a woman who had never needed him to enjoy herself. He stood at the edge of the room and watched her. He could not stop watching her. She was charming everyone, not with effort, not with performance, but with the quiet, attentive warmth of a woman who was genuinely interested in other people, and he understood with a clarity that arrived like a hand around his chest that he was not among them. She had not excluded him. She had simply taken him at his word. "I married you to save my name, not to know you." She had heard him. She had believed him, and she had arranged her life so that he could have exactly what he had asked for. The dowager noticed. She had come to Fenwick Park expecting to find ammunition, a weeping wife, a mismanaged household, evidence that Maren Calloway was the wrong choice. Instead, she found a woman who ran the house with quiet authority, who treated her with impeccable respect, and who maintained a distance from her husband so complete that it looked from the outside like contentment. The dowager watched Maren at meals, watched her in the drawing room, watched her walk the gardens with Mrs. Rowe, discussing which beds needed replanting and which could be left another season. She watched the way Maren's hands moved when she poured tea, precise, unhurried, the hands of a woman who had decided that every task deserved to be done well, regardless of whether anyone was watching. She watched, too, the way Crispin watched his wife when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes followed her across a room with the bewildered attention of a man who had locked a door and then realized the key was on the other side. The dowager had spent 40 years watching marriages conducted like sieges. She recognized, with an unease she could not quite name, that Maren was not laying siege to anything. She was simply living inside the walls she had been given and making them habitable. "She is not unhappy," the dowager said to Crispin one evening after Maren had excused herself to write letters. They were alone in the drawing room, and the fire was low, and the dowager's embroidery sat untouched in her lap. "No," Crispin agreed. "That is worse, I think." He looked at his mother. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had watched her own husband conduct their marriage with similar efficiency, and had spent 30 years wishing he had been less precise. Her face, in the firelight, looked older than he had noticed before, not tired but weathered, as though the years of composure had left their own kind of mark. "Your father," she said, and then stopped. She folded her hands. "Your father was also very clear about his terms." She left Fenwick Park the following morning without further comment, and Crispin stood in the gravel drive and watched her carriage disappear and understood that his mother had told him something she had never told him before. The weeks turned. May became June. The drainage works progressed. Maren had reviewed the estimates with Tench and identified that the contractor's second invoice included charges for materials already accounted for in the first, a detail that would have cost the estate £40 if it had passed unchallenged. Tench told Crispin this over port one evening, with the expression of a man who had been managing estates for 2 decades and had just been outperformed by a woman who had been a duchess for 3 months. Crispin attended the House of Lords for the early summer session and was away in London for a fortnight. The city was loud and familiar and entirely insufficient. He sat through debates on the corn question and the Irish situation and dined at his club and attended one evening at Lord Ashby's townhouse, where Ashby said nothing about Maren, which was worse than if he had said everything. At night, in the London house, Crispin sat in his study with a glass of brandy and thought about the way his wife turned the pages of her book, slowly, with one finger, as though each page deserved to be considered before it was left behind. When he returned to Fenwick Park, the household was running so smoothly that his absence had left no visible impression on its operation. The silver had been polished. The menus had been adjusted for the warmer weather, lighter suppers, cold collations at luncheon, the kind of practical elegance that suggested someone understood the difference between feeding a household and managing one. Maren had dealt with a dispute between 2 tenants regarding a boundary hedge. Tench reported this with the same bewildered admiration he brought to all reports of the Duchess's competence, adding that she had resolved it by walking the boundary herself, with the steward beside her, naturally, and suggesting a solution that satisfied both parties and left them both believing they had won. The tenants had begun referring to her as the Duchess, without the faintly questioning inflection that had attended the word in the early weeks. Crispin came home to a house that did not need him. He came home to a wife who greeted him in the entrance hall with Bess, the spaniel, pressing against her skirts. The dog had attached itself to Maren within days of the wedding, and now followed her from room to room with the devotion of a creature that recognized authority and warmth in equal measure. Maren inquired about his journey, ensured his rooms were prepared, mentioned that the roses in the south garden had come in particularly well, and that Mrs. Rowe had preserved the first strawberries. She wished him a good evening with the same composed warmth she offered the curate when he came for Sunday luncheon. He came home and found that the space beside her at breakfast had been set with his preferred coffee, and the newspaper folded to the parliamentary reports, and a small vase of sweet peas from the garden. Her garden now, tended through the gardener, and arranged with an eye for color that he had not known she possessed, and that all of this care had been delivered without any expectation that he would notice it. He noticed it. He noticed that she read in the library after supper, always in the chair beside the second window, where the candlelight was strongest. He noticed that she took her tea with lemon in the morning and milk in the afternoon. He noticed that she wore lavender water, faint and clean, and that the scent lingered in the corridor outside the morning room long after she had left it. He noticed that she had reorganized the library, not dramatically, not presumptuously, but the volumes on estate management and agriculture had migrated to the lower shelves where they could be reached without the ladder, and the poetry had moved to the table beside her chair. He noticed that he was cataloging her habits with the attention of a man who had been told he could not have something and had only then begun to want it. One night in late June, he found her in the library at midnight. She was reading. Cowper, he saw, the spine turned toward the candle, and she looked up when he entered with no surprise and no alarm. "Your Grace," she said, I did not expect you to be awake." I could not sleep. "The library is very good for that. Your father had excellent taste in poetry." He stood in the doorway. She was wearing a dressing gown of dark blue wool over her nightgown, and her hair was braided over one shoulder, and the candlelight turned her face into something he wanted to look at for longer than was appropriate when a woman had not invited looking. "Maren," he said. She closed the book, not abruptly, with the measured care of a woman who always marked her page. She set it on the table beside her chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She rose. She passed him in the doorway, close enough that the lavender reached him, close enough that he could have touched her sleeve, and she walked down the corridor toward the east wing without looking back. He stood in the library for a long time after she had gone. The candle on her table was still burning. The book was still warm when he picked it up. She had been reading a passage about solitude. He read it, standing in her light in her chair's warmth, surrounded by the faint ghost of her scent, and he understood that he had done something very precise and very stupid. He had told her not to let him know her, and she, being the woman she was, being the woman his father had apparently seen more clearly than he had, she had obliged. He went to the east wing. Not that night. He was not, despite his other failings, so clumsy as to arrive at a woman's door at midnight with no better offering than his own belated recognition. He spent the following day in a state of distraction so thorough that Tench asked him twice about the drainage accounts and received, both times, an answer that bore no relation to the question. He walked the grounds in the afternoon, alone, past the tenant cottages with their new roofs and the boundary hedge that Maren had adjudicated, and the south garden where her sweet peas climbed the trellis in orderly rows of pink and white and violet. Everything he looked at bore the quiet evidence of her attention. The estate was becoming, had already become, a reflection of a woman he had told not to reflect herself at all. He went to her door that evening, after supper, after she'd excused herself to write letters, after he had sat in the drawing room alone for 40 minutes, rehearsing sentences that sounded, each of them, insufficient. The corridor to the east wing was long and lit by candles set in sconces at intervals that threw pools of yellow light across the stone floor and left pools of shadow between them. His footsteps sounded very loud. He felt, absurdly, like a man approaching a threshold he was not certain he had earned the right to cross. He knocked. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the latch turned. She opened the door. She was still dressed, the pale gray muslin she had worn at dinner, her hair still pinned, as though she had not yet begun the process of putting the day away. Behind her he could see her room, the writing desk with its neat stack of correspondence, the candle burning beside the chair by the window, the book she had been reading face down on the arm. She looked at him with the same composed, courteous expression she had worn for 4 months, and she waited. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She held the door at precisely the angle that communicated neither welcome nor refusal, and she let the next moment belong to him. "I came to," he began, and stopped. The sentence he had rehearsed, something about wishing to discuss the household, something with a reasonable surface and a meaning underneath, dissolved the moment she looked at him. She did not help him. She did not offer an opening or a prompt or a gentle, "Yes, Your Grace?" She simply stood in her doorway and let him stand in his silence. "I said something to you," he managed, "on our wedding night. I said, I remember what you said." "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back. The corridor was very quiet. "I was wrong." She did not move. She did not soften. She regarded him with the steady, unsurprised attention of a woman who had been waiting, not for this moment specifically, but for the moment when the facts would become visible to the person who had arranged them. "In what particular?" she asked. He deserved that. He knew he deserved it. She had given him 4 months of flawless compliance with his stated wishes, and he had come to her door to tell her that his wishes had been wrong, and she was asking him to be specific. "In every particular," he said. "I told you I did not wish to know you. I was wrong. He stopped again. He was not a man accustomed to struggling with language. He sat in the House of Lords. He managed an estate of 11,000 acres. He had delivered the terms of their marriage with the confidence of a man reading a contract. And now he stood in a corridor and could not find a sentence equal to the woman in front of him. "I wish to know you," he said. It was not elegant. It was not the sentence he had rehearsed. It was the sentence underneath all the others, stripped of its furnishing, and it came out plain and graceless and true. Maren looked at him for a long time. The candle in her room behind her threw her shadow down the corridor, long and wavering, and he thought that she might close the door. He thought she had every right to close it. He had given her the architecture of a marriage without intimacy, and she had lived inside it with more grace than he had ever brought to any room, and she owed him nothing, not forgiveness, not softness, not the opening of a door he had closed himself. "Then you had better come in," she said, "and start." She stepped aside. He entered her room with her books on the table and her shawl over the chair and the lavender sachets in the wardrobe that scented the air, and she closed the door behind him and sat in the chair by the window and folded her hands and waited for him to find the next sentence and the one after that. He did not find them all that night, but he found enough. He told her about his father, not the public version, the version spoken at the funeral and recorded in the estate's history, but the private one. The man who had married for position and spent 30 years sitting across the breakfast table from a woman he had never learned to reach. The man who had grown quiet in his final years, not from illness alone, but from the accumulated weight of a life conducted at arm's length. The man who had written a will that was, Crispin understood now, an act of intervention from beyond the grave, a father's last attempt to save his son from the inheritance that mattered least, the title, the estate, the name, and most of all, the habit of keeping people at precisely the distance where they could not hurt you and could not help you either. Maren listened. She sat in her chair by the window with her hands folded and her face still, and she listened the way she did everything, completely, without performance, without the need to fill silence with reassurance. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time, and the candle burned lower, and the house settled around them with the particular creaking of old timber that sounds, in the right kind of silence, like breathing. "I was afraid," she said at last, "on the way to the church, not of you, of hoping." They did not become a love story in the way that ballads suggest. No single declaration, no dramatic reunion, no grand gesture witnessed by 300 guests. They became a love story in the way that rooms become warm, gradually, then all at once, then so thoroughly that one cannot remember the cold. He learned that she read Cowper and also Wordsworth, and that she disliked Pope, whom she found clever but unkind. He learned that she had been afraid on their wedding day, not of him, but of the possibility that she might allow herself to hope and be disappointed. He learned that the decision she had made in the carriage had cost her more than she had let him see, and that the 4 months of composure had been, in their own way, a kind of endurance. She learned that his father's will had not been cruelty but foresight. The late Duke had known his son, had known the particular emotional efficiency Crispin had inherited from a marriage conducted on the same terms, and had chosen Maren Calloway because he had met her once at a neighboring estate and had seen in her the steadiness that his son would need and would not know to value until it was nearly beyond his reach. She learned that Crispin's coldness on their wedding night had been fear dressed as certainty, that he had rehearsed the words because he did not trust himself to improvise, and that the precision of his cruelty had been the precision of a man who was terrified of what he might feel if he allowed himself to feel anything at all. The Dowager returned to Fenwick Park in October and found the drawing room rearranged. Maren's chair had moved from the window to the fireplace beside Crispin's, and there was a second teacup on the table between them. The Dowager sat in the chair across from them and watched her son watch his wife and said nothing, but when Maren left the room to speak with Mrs. Rowe about dinner, the Dowager looked at her son and said, "Your father chose well." "Yes," Crispin said. "He did." Lord Ashby visited at Christmas. He watched Crispin hand Maren into her chair at dinner with a care that was new and unperformed, and he watched Maren look at Crispin across the table with an expression that was no longer composed but simply warm, and he said, to no one in particular, "Well, that took longer than it needed to." Maren laughed. It was the laugh Crispin had heard at the county ball, natural, unguarded, but this time it was directed at him, and he discovered that being inside her laughter was a different experience altogether from hearing it across a room. The daughter arrived the following autumn. A girl with Maren's dark hair and Crispin's gray eyes, born in the East Wing bedroom that Maren had never relinquished because it had become, over the months, theirs. Mrs. Rowe brought hot water and clean linen and wept in the corridor, which she would deny if asked. Tench recorded the birth in the estate ledger with the date and the weight and the name, Clara Eloise Voss, and drew a small line beneath it, the only flourish he had ever permitted himself in 20 years of stewardship. Crispin held his daughter for the first time in the chair beside the library window, Maren's chair, though it had been his first, and looked at the small, furious, perfect face and thought that his father had known. His father, who had conducted his own marriage with the same cold efficiency and had spent 30 years regretting it, had looked at a neighbor's daughter and seen the woman who would refuse to let his son repeat the same mistake, not by fighting him, not by weeping, not by making scenes, but by the simple devastating act of believing what he said. Years later, Clara was 4, and there was a second child on the way, and the drainage works had long since been completed, and the tenants' cottages had new roofs, and Fenwick Park had become the kind of house where laughter carried through the corridors, and the morning room smelled of sweet peas and lavender. Clara asked, as children do, how her parents had fallen in love. Crispin looked at Maren across the breakfast table. She was eating toast. She looked back at him with one eyebrow slightly raised, which was the expression she wore when she was enjoying his discomfort and had no intention of rescuing him from it. "I said something very stupid," he told his daughter, "and your mother was kind enough to outlast it." Clara considered this with the solemnity of a child who suspects she is not being given the full account. "What did you say?" Maren set down her toast. "He said he did not wish to know me." "That is stupid," Clara agreed. "Yes," Crispin said. He looked at his wife, who had walked out of his bedchamber on their wedding night and had kept walking until he learned to follow. It was. The morning light came through the breakfast room windows, warm and bright, catching the silver coffee pot and the white tablecloth and the small vase of sweet peas that Maren still arranged herself through the gardener every Monday. Outside, the park stretched green and settled under a sky that looked like it had been there forever. Inside, the Duke of Fenwick reached across the table and took his wife's hand, and she let him, and neither of them said anything, because they had long since passed the point where words were required. Some stories arrive with thunder, a declaration, a reversal, a grand gesture made before witnesses. Others arrive the way morning arrives, slowly, then completely, without anyone able to name the exact moment the dark became light. This was the second kind. And if you have found your way here, to this story of silence and steadiness and the slow work of being known, then perhaps you understand. Perhaps you have stood on one side of a closed door and wondered whether to knock. Perhaps you have taken someone at their word and discovered that words, even true ones, are not always the final thing. They arrive here, like a door answered before the knock is finished, whenever they are ready,